right, thank you, Angela. What I'd like to do as we get underway tonight, again, thank all of you for being here. I'd like to, I guess, cover 3 or 4 things. I'm going to talk a little bit really about the general relationship of states and local governments, talk a little bit about the history of how we got to what's now called Public Act 4, because it's the first of really 3. Talk about how the differences between the current law and some of the earlier ones, and then, if time permits, I may touch up very briefly on a couple of the pro and anti arguments, although I think we'll hear a lot of that from some other panel members this evening as well. So let me start off with one thing I guess we don't often think about. We think about local government, cities, villages, townships, counties, and a lot of others beyond that. And that is the fact that local governments are really kind of in an odd position in the American constitutional horizon. They are what are called creatures of the state. The U.S. Constitution does not guarantee any state or any person the right to have local governments. It allows states to create local governments, and all states have done so. But they have done so in a lot of different ways. The details of the sheer number of local governments and the powers they have vary enormously around the country. For example, just to give you kind of one opening picture, the state with the fewest local governments is Hawaii, which has 18. The state with the most is Illinois, which has almost 7,000. Michigan has about 3,000. If you count all the local governments, all the cities, all the villages, all the townships, all the special districts, and lots of other stuff, again, a little more than 3,000 here in Michigan. And because local governments are what are called creatures of the state, the powers they have always been limited by the state. I don't want to get too technical here, but there's a thing that goes back a good century or more called Dillon's Rule, not Andy Dillon, the current state treasurer, but again, a century-old law case, that simply says that local governments only have the powers granted to them by the state. Now, it's been modified a little bit over the years by some home rule charters and all that, but in general, bottom line is local governments are a creature of the state, and states have long had the power to essentially do what they want with local governments. In fact, I even make the point that theoretically, I make the point in class, that theoretically, if some state wanted to get rid of all local governments altogether and do so, they could do so. It'd be an administrative mess, but it could be done. And again, as I pointed out, the numbers of states have vary an awful lot. Well, because of that fact, states have long had the ability to step in to local government activities in many ways, particularly financial ways. Here in Michigan, the law that really kind of set a structure for the state stepping into local government financial affairs has undergone kind of 3 steps along the way. The first law goes back to 1988, and it was basically, it was designed primarily for situations in E-Course and Hamtramck of the late 1980s, and it allowed the appointment of an emergency manager basically when these cities, or any other local government too, was just about on the verge of bankruptcy. And the power the emergency manager had was significant, but in particular did not allow the emergency manager to cancel existing contracts, either labor or otherwise. Now that again, so the first version is the 1988 version under Governor Blanchard. By 1990, what's called Public Act 72 comes into place, and it's amended half a dozen times over the years in 92, 2002, 2003, and a few other times. And that, again, allows an emergency manager to come in, but still with significantly limited powers. They can put together budgets, they can suggest things, they can limit the power of elected officials, but again, for the most part, they did not have the power to cancel existing contracts. So, and again, that was the law that applied to Flint in 2002, and a variety of others. There were 9 governments that were dealt with what was then called Public Act 72 beginning in 1990. Hamtramck, Highland Park, Flint, the Inkster Schools, the Village of Three Oaks, E-Course, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, and Detroit Public Schools. And in that same context, River Rouge had a consent agreement that followed the somewhat similar guidelines that we have now. So again, the key thing was, though, that law was normally invoked only when a government was on the verge of bankruptcy in some way. So let me now shift gears a little bit and at least touch upon some of the key elements of the current law, what's commonly called Public Act 4, or often called simply the Emergency Manager Law, and in particular how it differs with some of the earlier laws, because there's a number of things that are the same, but there are some really big differences as well. So first of all, the current law, Public Act 4 as it's commonly called, does retain a number of aspects of the earlier law. First of all, it does retain a number of elements of what are called trigger events, so situations where the state can come in, although it expands upon those significantly. Secondly, it creates a review team. Team comes in, finds whether there's a need for an emergency manager, and makes a recommendation. Third, like the old law, there is a provision for consent agreements, although expanded somewhat under the new law as well. There's also a review and appeal process that was in the old law. That's also in the new law as well. And then, of course, the state can appoint a financial manager, emergency financial manager, with specified duties. Now, here's where the differences come in. What I've just said here is the stuff that's the same. The differences, though, are that, number one, there is an increase in the number of what are called trigger events. Now, these get kind of technical, but the bottom line is, because of the increase in these trigger events, it is easier and quicker for the state to step in and begin to take action. They don't necessarily have to wait until you're on the verge of bankruptcy. And again, there's a long shopping list of those things, but it is a significant change. So again, the usual assumption is that with the new law, the state can, if it chooses to, step in earlier in the process. The consent agreements are laid out in the new law, Public Act 4, in much greater detail than they were laid out before. And as we'll take a look at as we go along, one of the incentives in this new law is to kind of encourage, maybe even force local governments to adopt these consent agreements. The big difference, though, is the change in powers of the emergency manager. And again, I'm going to go through a quick list here. I'm going to touch upon this. I suspect we'll say a lot more about all of these as we go along. Number one, first of all, the emergency manager is paid for by the local government. That's not a change, but that's a significant part to note this evening. Secondly, the emergency manager can void or modify local contracts, and that's going to be a key issue. This is one reason why labor especially is very, very angry at the emergency manager law. And I might mention that those contracts also apply to suppliers, not just union contracts, but all contracts are subject to modification in one way or another. The emergency manager can sell public assets, can modify budget, can change and modify budgets as well, can hire and fire local governmental employees. If necessary, can even initiate bankruptcy proceedings. One of the arguments for Public Act 4 is that it's an attempt to avoid bankruptcy, but an emergency manager can begin the process to at least initiate the process. Let me summarize in my last 2 minutes at least, because I'm getting a few fingers over here, on some of the key elements of this law. First of all, the emergency manager cannot raise taxes, but can order millage elections. Can't directly raise taxes, but can order millage elections. Can also, and this is an enormous power if it was ever carried out, can begin the process to dissolve or even merge governments. Now, that's not totally at the option of the emergency manager. It's got to go through a boundary commission and many steps, but the process could begin if they want to get rid of or merge governments together. Can ignore local charters. Local charters can be ignored essentially in any way at all. Can remove local officials. And even in some cases, if the pension fund is less than 80% funded, can step in and play a role in dealing with the whole pension funding process. The emergency manager can be removed by a 2/3 vote of the legislature and also serves at the pleasure of the governor. Now that's kind of a quick summary of some of the things that changes in the law. Very briefly, some of the arguments in favor of it are it is seen as an alternative to bankruptcy, a nuclear option to force governments to step in and take action. The arguments against it, very briefly, we'll say more about, I think, is very anti-democratic. I mean, it's removing a whole batch of elected officials who were chosen by local voters. It violates the right to contracts, both in the Michigan and the U.S. constitutions. may impose costs upon local governments in violation of the Headley Amendment that limits governmental expenses in various ways. I indicated earlier that there's no guarantee of local governments on the federal level, but the Michigan Constitution, like most state constitutions, does say a lot about state and local governments, and there may be a violation there. So, bottom line, that's a real quick look at some of the pros and cons, and I'll pass the baton to my next panel member.
Thank you, Paul.